a brief introduction to me. I'm Laura Johnson. I'm a certified life coach for Christian women, and I love to help them discover and achieve whatever they feel called to do, to really move into that full potential. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. If you don't have a pen and paper, go and grab one. If you're moving about and you're just listening to it, that's okay. I just want you to be thinking about these questions. So I'm going to read you some questions, and I want you just to answer yes or no for yourself. Do you feel guarded when you are around other people? Do you scroll more than you post? And just yes or no, I just want you to kind of gauge where you're at. Do you post a lot of pictures of your head and up, but nothing of like the rest of your body? Or do you also post a lot of pictures of your kids, but not really anything of you? Do you spend lots of time dreaming, but not not taking action on any of those dreams? When somebody gives you feedback, it feels like shock waves through your body, like it's so painful to hear feedback. Do you find that you are always comparing yourself and how you measure up compared to other people? Do you tell your kids and loved ones that it's okay to make mistakes, but you spend hours trying to avoid the wrong decision? Do you talk to yourself in a way that you would never talk to another human? Have you stopped setting goals because you feel like you just forget them or you never reach them and you're tired of being discouraged or disappointed? Is it hard to make friends, or does it feel like all the conversations with other people are very surface level? Do you feel like you've never really fit in, like never belonged somewhere, that like you're a misfit or quirky or kind of weird? Okay. So I want you to just really ask yourself, you can even go over to the chat box. Did any of those resonate with you? Did you find that you were answering yes to those? Because if so, you are in the right place. This is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And why these things, yes to a lot of them, says Heather. Yes. I have taken all of these from client experiences as well as personal experiences. We have all experienced these. That is the human experience that we're going through. But the difference in what Brené really talks about is how we approach and how we solve for these. And so, for a lot of people, and what I find a lot in my clients, what I find in people that I work with, is that some of the things they'll do is they'll just take themselves off social media because they can't stop comparing, or they'll just give up on their dreams and they think it's just for other people. Something else is they'll find that they'll start saying a lot of positive affirmations, but they don't actually believe what they're saying. Or they meet a whole bunch of new friends at a place or on an app, but it doesn't go anywhere. I've also seen that when they don't feel like they fit in, they'll start pinning a lot of new styles and clothes on Pinterest in order to like be more in style and to fit in, with our clothes. And the other thing that I find is that a lot of people get really passive aggressive where they know what they want, but they don't know how to communicate it. And they start getting almost resentful and get really passive aggressive. So that's typically what happens when all of these things are happening underneath. That's where people start to go. They think that's what the solution is. But what usually ends up happening is that we just end up still being a very insecure person. We're still very guarded around other people, and we're discouraged that everybody else has it figured out except for us. I will add that you might have different clothes. Like you might go out and buy a bunch of different clothes, but it's not changing what's happening on the inside. And that's what I want you to really see, that this really missing out on our full potential and really daring greatly in our lives, that feeling stuck, that's the greatest pain that we can experience in this life, because we are missing out on our purpose here on this earth. And it then becomes so painful when we start seeing everybody else, and our brain will start wrapping it up that they all have some secret sauce, something magical about them, that it works for them, but it's never possible for us. That is such a painful place to live. And that's why this book, Daring Greatly, is such an impactful book for every single one of us, because she gives us the long-term solution on how to answer that full potential. How do we move towards it? And the reason she gives us right at the beginning of the book is wholehearted living, is what she calls it. She says, this is the place when you're wholehearted living, where you're going to dare greatly, where you're going to step into the arena that you are going to have more challenges than you've ever had before, but also more joy than ever. And so she goes more in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. We're doing that in October. So make sure, like, on the calendar, you look for that. So that's the book we're doing in October to learn more about the wholehearted living. But today, what we're going to talk about is that when we move and we dare greatly, we're spending time in a lot of shame and vulnerability. That's how we become wholehearted living people. So in order to start with that, we have to first understand the culture that we live in, and she calls it the not enough culture. So we're going to be using the whiteboard. I like to take notes. I'm a very visual learner, so just a heads up on that. So she calls it the not enough culture. And this stems from something she calls a scarcity. And I don't know if you've ever heard that word before, but it's like a hyper awareness that lack exists, that there's just never enough of some kind of resource. And she said that that you'll know that you're living in this not enough culture based on three things. So she said the first is shame. And it will show up like if you feel like your self-worth is tied to achievement. So really looking at, here, let me write this down. So self-worth is based on achievement, on productivity, on compliance to some kind of standard or rule. So that's when you know that you're in the not enough culture. The next one that she talks about in the book is comparison. You'll know if you're in the not enough culture because you'll find yourself in comparison. And she says that if you're constantly thinking other people's gifts or their way of being is more valuable than the gifts you have. And even not being able to see your own gifts, that's a huge thing as well. So really see that comparison is also a sign that you're in the not enough culture and that you're living from a place of lack. The third one is she talks about disengaging. And you'll know that you're in disengaging because you're afraid to try new things. New things. Okay, there we go. She said, you're afraid to try new things, that you will stay quiet versus sharing your stories and your experiences with other human beings. So I want you to think about this for yourself. Really examine for your own life. That's how you're going to get the most out of this book and really apply it. Is where do you recognize the not enough culture showing up for yourself? And you can go over to the chat box. You can type in 1, 2, or 3, 1 through 3, 1, 3, not 2. Like really examine that for yourself. So go over to the chat box. Number 3, so disengaging. So you're afraid to try new things. It's really hard. I'm not going to lie. All of these are hard to look at and hard to really feel the pain that exists there. 1 through 3. Yes, Heather, like I can see all 3 of these in my own life even. And I teach this to people all the time. Number 3, thank you, Becky. So keep going. You can keep going over there. So one of the things that I recognize is that when I'm stuck in the not enough culture, I will always start experiencing thoughts about time, thoughts about money, and thoughts about my energy level. That will always tell me that I'm in one of these 3 things. These are clues that I use for myself. So I think about when I'm stressed about time, when I'm stressed about money or energy, I can always use that as a symptom that something deeper is going on, that I am stuck in this not enough culture. So she said that, when we're in this not enough culture, the scarcity, she said, oftentimes people will go to the other extreme of abundance. Like there's more time, like my gifts are valuable to the world, but most of us don't believe that. So it's so far of a jump that it just doesn't work. And so she said that like, we have to meet ourselves and really understand that the opposite of the not enough culture is the enough, like being enough, and creating a culture that exactly who we are is worthy and is enough for everybody. She said, this is the spot where we feel the most vulnerable and where we really have to confront our own worthiness. So when we get to this point right here, is we start to face vulnerability. So let me write this out. Vulnerability. So one thing you'll learn about me very quick is I'm an expert speller, expert speller. But the second I turn the camera on, I get really nervous. It's very vulnerable for me to spell in front of other people. All right. So she talks about vulnerability. This is how we get to a space of believing that we are enough and stepping outside of the not enough culture. Now, I love her definition. And if you go to the book, let me pull it up really quick. She has this definition on page 33. Let me find it really quick. So she says, vulnerability is the core of all emotions and feelings. To feel is to be vulnerable. Really let that sink in. Like when we feel emotions, that is us being vulnerable. And I think we live in a society where we think we have to post really brave things, or we have to, dress in some some way that maybe isn't comfortable to us. And that's like being vulnerable, like putting ourselves out there. So I love this definition because I think it goes across like some of the counterculture that's happening around vulnerability. That to be vulnerable is to feel emotions. And when we start feeling emotions, that's like the uncertainty, the risk that we start taking. That's where we start like emotionally exposing ourselves, really. So I want you to think about this. Let me draw a picture first to really hone this down. Okay. So imagine we're going to add some hair to you guys. Yeah. Okay, so imagine you're on a surfboard, okay? The way I imagine emotions is like a wave. And you'll feel this for yourself. When you're feeling emotions, it will come on really strong and it's like you're at the height of the emotion. Now, typically what happens is this is where we start feeling the most vulnerable at the peak, where we will start, if you start sitting in a sad movie and you find yourself wanting to cry and you start shoving it back down. Well, that's what you're feeling. You're feeling very vulnerable right now. You're feeling emotions. Or you really want to tell somebody that you love them and you don't feel like you can say the words yet. And so you start like shoving it down, like, don't come up, don't come up. That feels really scary. But when we're feeling emotions, we have to give ourselves the chance to go over the wave. We ride the emotion all the way through. This is vulnerability. This is when we feel an emotion all the way through without trying to numb or distract ourselves from it. So she gives us some myths about vulnerability and all of her. So she's a researcher. She's a beautiful researcher. She collects stories of people and analyzes the data from all of that. So the first myth that she talks about is that we're just going to do is a weakness. And she says in all of her research, all her interviews that she did, that this was a very strong myth for a lot of people. So there was, there's every single one of us, I'm sure, can think about like the way we were raised or the family culture, or like my mom is an incredible person, absolutely incredible, but I never saw her cry. Like there was no crying for mama. Same thing with my dad. I remember the first time that my dad started crying. I was leaving to a different country to serve a mission for my church, and he just broke down. And you know what? It freaked me out a lot. I was like, I've never seen my dad show emotion. I thought emotion was a weakness, vulnerability was a weakness. And I learned very quickly in that moment that that simply is not true at all. So when she talks about this, like we have to really examine this for ourselves, because what she said vulnerability is vulnerability. Hold on, let me find exactly where it is. She said vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. And that's where I want you to see for yourself. And fill in this blank. Vulnerability is, and then fill in the blank. Like how, when you think about it for you, vulnerability is what? You can go over to the chat box and share your answer. I'll share a couple that as I was doing this activity with for myself, I'll share just a couple that I came up with. Vulnerability is the first to say, I love you. When you're in a relationship, I remember thinking about this with my husband, like the first time we said, I love you to each other, oh, like so scary. It's very vulnerable. Let's see. Another one was vulnerability for me is posting about my business on social media. I have a thriving business. I have the most amazing clients, and it's very vulnerable still years later for me to post about my business. So again, go over to the chat box, fill in the blank for you on what this is. Another one I came up with, vulnerability for me, I'm going to be honest, is not wearing shorts over my swimsuit, because when I was younger, I had a lot of body issues and confidence issues as far as that goes. And I always wore shorts with my swimsuit, but I'm like really proud of where I'm at. And I want to be able to be myself and not cover that up. Doesn't matter if you want to cover it up, just recognize what is vulnerability for you. Vulnerability for me is being real with who I am as a mom. Bree, that's so important. Like that's really hard. Every single time we walk out and we parent our kids in public, that's being vulnerable. It's giving ourselves the opportunity to feel emotions that other people may disagree with the way we're parenting, and that's okay. So you can keep going over and answer those. I'll share one last one. Another way of like being vulnerable is seeking help. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute, but that is one of the hardest things for me to do, is to ask for help. So that is a huge one. Vulnerability is for me seeking help, asking for help. Okay. So going back to what she said, like vulnerability will always feel like courage. That doesn't mean courage feels good. Courage feels like shit, let's be honest. But putting yourselves out there is never a weakness. So the next one that she talks about, the next myth, is that I don't do vulnerability. And I love what she said. She said, if you don't do vulnerability, vulnerability will do you. Like, that's just life. Like, it's going to happen. She said, vulnerability isn't a choice. The only choice we have is how we respond to uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure. So we can either shut down when we get to these vulnerable places, or we can lean into them and discover more about who we are. Yeah, Connie, oh my gosh, I love this. So being vulnerability, going back to that first one, is being a presenter without all my ducks in a row. Yes. Been there many times. Okay, so the next one, vulnerability is letting it all hang out. And this goes back to like, the shock and awe factor that we think in order to be vulnerable, we have to post like really shocking things on social media or, whatever that might be. And she said that vulnerability, what it really boils down to is sharing who you are with those that have earned the right to hear it. And that the openness that exists there is very mutual. She said, boundaryless vulnerability leads to disconnection. And when we go and we have that shock and awe factor, we're trying to like put ourselves out there with people that haven't earned the right to hear it. She said it can also be a form of protection and how we deal with unmet needs. Meaning, like if we're trying to seek validation from other people when we share something. And I really liked that because, I have shared some really bold things as part of my business online. But it was years before I did that. I created connection with so many of these people, and it was still scary to say things, but it was never from a place of validation. Like, please come and tell me that you think I'm cool. It was just that this is who I am, and I'm going to show more of who I am within a community that I've created online. So that's another thing. Vulnerability is letting it all hang out. These are all vulnerability myths. I should write that just in case somebody is coming in. I don't want them to think that these are the definitions of vulnerability. Okay, so the next one is that we can do it alone. This is one of those myths that I believed for the longest time. So the church that I am part of, the Christian church that I am part of, we have a lot of discussion around being self-reliant, and that's a very good thing. But it was like I had took all those amazing lessons to the extreme. And I started thinking that I had to do all that I could do before God would step in, before I could ask for help. I needed to go to the very darkest place within my mind and physically before I could ask for help. And then it was a weakness. So I created this vicious cycle within myself. I see this a lot in my clients that they are good Christian women that want to serve people. But yet if they ask for help, it's somehow like a knock against their self-worth that they couldn't do it. And I love what she said is that this journey, the vulnerability journey, our life journey was never meant to do alone. She said asking for help is the most vulnerable thing that you can do. And so I wanted to share just a brief example on that. So with my third baby, so he's 3.5 now, I had severe pain and I couldn't understand the pain. And I was like shaming myself. We're going to talk about shame in just a second about this pain. I thought I just couldn't hack pregnancy. I was well into my 30s. So I thought maybe I was just getting old. I didn't know what was going on. And so I shamed myself and didn't really listen. Well, it got to the point where the pain was so bad that I was using a walker while I was pregnant. And then once I had my baby, I was in a wheelchair. And I know now what happened. Like my pelvis had separated too far from all the hormones in my body. And it literally felt like my crotch was being ripped in half. That's like the best way to describe it. It was so painful. But after, when I was in a wheelchair, we lived in a 2-story house, I couldn't care for my kids, and I had a newborn. Like I had no idea what in the world I was going to do. And I had to ask for help. And it was the most painful experience I have ever been. So vulnerable, having somebody come in while like after pregnancy is not pretty. I don't really want them doing my laundry, but I couldn't even do laundry at the time. Like it was so challenging, but such a vulnerable experience that the people that came in and helped in my home, there will be an eternal connection and gratitude and love that I share with those human beings. And I am so grateful for that experience. It completely changed the way that I view vulnerability. That is like the moments where we dare the most, where we really dare greatly is when we ask for help in every single one of these. So I want you to really consider that for yourself. So of the vulnerability myths, I want you to go back over to the chat box. Tell me, which one have you experienced? I know I've been on all of them. I'm sure you have at some point as well. So consider that for yourself. Go over to the chat box. Tell me which ones you've experienced. So when we get to this point, and sometimes people will say, well, I'm not very good at vulnerability. And I love what Brené Brown says in the book. She says, if you think you're not good at vulnerability, then you're really good at shame, which that would hit me to my core. Like, okay, if I'm feeling vulnerable right now, it's because I'm shaming myself in some way. So I'm going to share the definition. So it's on page 68, if you do have the book, on her definition of shame, because I think it's really powerful. Okay, let me see. Well, maybe I have the wrong page. Okay, shame is the fear of disconnection. We are psychologically, emotionally, cognitively, and spiritually wired for connection, love, and belonging. Connection, along with love and belonging, is why we are here, and it's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. Shame is the fear of disconnection. It's the fear that something we've done or failed to do, an ideal that we've not lived up to, or a goal that we've not accomplished makes us unworthy of connection. It's an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. That was that one was like, oh, yep, totally get you, Brené. And this is everyone. That is one thing that I can see so clearly as a life coach, is that every single person experiences shame. And it's not, and she talks about this in the book, it's not about getting rid of the shame. It's not resisting it. It's becoming resilient while you're experiencing shame. And we're going to go through the steps on how to do that. So I want to get really clear first before we go there. So shame is that fear of disconnection. And it's also that belief that we're somehow flawed or unworthy, that something we've done has caused that, or our existence. So when we think about shame, another word that often comes up is guilt. So I wanted to really touch on this for just a second, because as Christian women, we talk about the word godly sorrow a lot. And the way I interpret this and the research she has and the way that Brené talks about it is this is also the difference between godly sorrow and what Satan would use as discouragement or despair. We're going to just call it Satan despair. Like when we're in the shame, it feels as there is no hope, that something is fundamentally wrong and that we will never be able to change. Whereas when we feel guilt, it's very much a godly sorrow. So the way she describes it is shame, or let's say guilt right here, is I did something that was bad. Okay, that I am a worthy human and I did something that was bad. Whereas she talks about shame being I am bad. Okay, and so the difference here is that when we feel guilt, I did something bad, we have that godly sorrow, there is the potential for positive emotions to move us forward, to propel us in our lives. When we feel shame, we actually become more discouraged and go deeper into the despair. Shame will never be useful. It will never be something that helps you reach your full potential. And it is one of one of those things that you'll know really clear when you're in shame. Let's just put it that way, because it will feel like you're spinning in a vortex that you can't get out of. I call it the shame vortex. Whereas when you are feeling guilt over something, you're still feeling a negative emotion, but it can propel you closer to God. And so that's what I want you to see for yourself, is that we got to get clear on, are you feeling guilty about something or are you shaming yourself? Because there is a place for guilt. Shame will not benefit you. So in order to reach our full potential, in order to dare greatly, we got to separate our self-worth so that we can feel our emotions without it being a reflection of who we are. And so the way that she talks about this is that our self-worth is separate from the things that we do. And I think about it this way. Is let's say, XY axis, okay? So we have our worthiness line up here. As children of God, as daughters of God, as human beings, we have an infinite worth. However, there is times where our self-esteem will fluctuate based on the thoughts that we think. So when we are looking at shame, in order to be resilient to it, again, we're not resisting it, it won't always go away, but in order to be resilient to it, we have to recognize and remember that as a human being, we have infinite worth. That will never change regardless of what we do. Remember, shame is I am bad. You cannot have this belief of defined worth if you think you are fundamentally flawed. So that's where I wanted to show, to help you really drive down that you as a human being have defined worth. You are a child of God. And yes, there are thoughts that you will have that will fluctuate your self-esteem. So when we get and we can start separating these two things, this is where we can really start understanding how to become shame resilient based on our thoughts of worthiness. And so when we get there, she says the greatest antidote to shame is empathy. And the shame resilience is what will eventually lead us to empathy. So we're going to talk about the 4 steps that she says in order to develop empathy. Okay, so the first one, so real quick, I'm just going to pause. Let's all just do a check-in. We're talking about some big things today. How's everybody doing? Do you have any questions? I'm going to write a couple things down. You can go over to the chat box and ask any questions, share some insight that you've had while I write this down, and then I'll come back and read those. Okay, so, and we're going to talk about these steps. So again, we're just taking a quick pause, check in with yourself. How are you feeling right now as we're talking about these things? Okay. Yeah. So I love what Bree said. She had done all the myths. The asking for help, the alone one is the hardest for me. Yeah, Bree, that is definitely one that like I really had that myth for a long time. Vulnerability for me is asking for or admitting what I really want. That is, Miranda, thank you for sharing that. That is a really tough thing on knowing what we want inside and having the courage to speak it out loud. And you're right, that is a very vulnerable place to be. So when we're experiencing shame and we're moving and understanding our worthiness and confronting ourselves as our greatest critic, empathy is how we start becoming shame resilient. So she gives us 4 steps to get to the path of empathy. The first is to understand your triggers. Now, this can be something like standing on a scale. This can be something like opening social media. This can be walking out of your house and seeing another human. It doesn't matter what the triggers are, but recognize what are your triggers. Now, most people, and we talked about this briefly in the beginning, is we think we have to remove all the triggers. Let's take all the triggers out so we'll never feel these emotions again. But it doesn't work that way because our brain will find more triggers somewhere. So, in order to develop empathy, you have to understand your triggers and then increase your awareness about why it's a trigger. So, really looking at, okay, so if this standing on the scale is a trigger, why is it a trigger? Is it because there's some unattainable standard you have created for yourself based on the beauty industry that we live in and breathe every single day? Is same with social media. What are you telling yourself about the standards that you're not living up to? Increase awareness about what those standards are. Why are these things a trigger? The next is reaching out and talking to somebody. Now, I will say, like, I'm going to write this down. Who can you call? So the very first time I learned about vulnerability, it was I was sitting with a therapist. I had postpartum depression really badly after my second baby. And about 8 months in, I had the very strong thought of like, this isn't going well. Like, I need help. This is beyond me. And that was one of the most courageous, still to this day, that was one of the most courageous things I ever did, was to find a therapist and to tell my husband that things were not okay with me because he was at work. He didn't see what was really going on. And so I remember sitting in her chair and her teaching me. She was the very first one ever. This was 7 years ago. She was the first one ever that talked to me about vulnerability and taught me about Brené Brown. And she said, when you're struggling, who do you call? And I was like, well, what do you mean? Like, you don't tell people you're struggling, lady. Like, I was so confused. Like, I don't share those parts of me. It was too vulnerable. Like, I thought, going back to that, vulnerability was a weakness. And so she really taught me that, like, creating a community for yourself on people that you can reach out to. And I'll get very, like, really specific with you on this, okay? There are friends that you can call to vent to. There are other people when I'm feeling vulnerability that I will reach out to. They will not talk me out of my negative emotion. You want to honor what you're feeling and have somebody hold a space without making it mean something's gone wrong. Like really, really give yourself that permission to be vulnerable with somebody and say, I just need you to listen and hold space for me right now. I'm feeling shame. Can you love me while I experience this emotion? The next is to really speak about the shame, and I noticed this with myself on very early in my business. I recognized that if I felt like I did something wrong, I posted something and I felt shame about it, or I started like I'd never spoken about myself, I'd never marketed myself, and I was feeling a lot of shame. And so it got to where I would just say, "Okay, shame, you're back. I can see you. Throw your tantrum. I'm going to be here. Just throw it." And it was like saying it out loud, like it was another person in the room, took away its power. Shame, as Brené Brown talks about in the book, shame thrives in darkness. But the second we speak it already, we take our power back, and we are in control of it. Even though it's still happening, we can be okay in those moments. So check in with yourself, write these things down, put them on a sticky note somewhere where you can see that, when you've gone in, you start thinking there must be something wrong with me. I'll never figure this out. Those are all shame things that will usually start with an I statement. Write these down so that you can come back to them and practice empathy, knowing that you as a human have worth, and you can check in with the emotions of shame that you're experiencing. So when we get to this point and we start dipping our toe into the vulnerability pool, we'll recognize that something very quickly will come up. Okay. Brené Brown talks about it as your vulnerability armor. We're going to just write that. And you will know that this is happening to you because when you're having a conversation, it will feel like there's a force field around you where there are very certain things that you think maybe you want to say. You're like, no, I'm not going to go there. Again, like we talked about, trusting the other person, having that openness. But even then, you still keep this wall around you. So she said what's really interesting is that most people, when they have a vulnerability armor, they start asking, who am I? They don't know who they are anymore. And I find this in so many of my clients is that, when they come to me and they really want to discover, the reason why they have a hard time answering this question is because they have been wearing vulnerability armor for so long that it becomes a second skin. They don't even realize that second skin is there. And oftentimes they'll think, oh, well, it happened in motherhood. As soon as I became a mom, I forgot who I was. Or, even looking at if you don't have children, recognizing who you were as a child and who you are now, there's usually a disconnect there. That's when we start putting that vulnerability armor on, that we forget what we look like without it and what experiencing the world without it would even be. So in this moment, she talks about how in order to take down the shield, let me back. She said the vulnerability arsenal is three things. She talks about foreboding joy, which if you saw the book club last month, we talked a lot about foreboding joy and how that works with our upper limit switch, as Gay Hendricks called it in the Big Leap. So you can go back and watch that recording. It's amazing. So the foreboding joy is when you're constantly looking over your shoulder, things are going so well, something's going to go wrong. It's your body feeling vulnerable and it wants to put up a barrier of protection around you. And so in order to move beyond that, she talks about developing gratitude. Now, this is different than I should be more grateful. That's not gratitude. Everybody just get that out of lay that out on the table. That is not gratitude. That will never help with foreboding joy, with vulnerability, with shame. If you tell yourself, I should be more grateful, you are shaming yourself. Plain and simple. In order to move beyond that, in order to feel true gratitude, there's something very simple that you can do. You can talk about how I feel uncertain and dot, dot, dot. List something that you're grateful for. This one sentence will change the way that you feel. This is how you experience gratitude. I just watched the movie Soul last night with my kids. And if you haven't watched it, it's on Disney Plus. It's incredible. But he really he shows this very well, the main character, Joe Gardner, where he gets to the point where he's able to see the very simple things of life. And there was like one of those little like helicopter type looking leaves. We call them helicopter leaves when we were kids, that had come down from a tree, and like how beautiful it was spiraling down from the tree. Like in that moment, there was uncertainty and he could see the beauty of the tree. And so when you're getting to that point, when you're feeling your vulnerability armor up there, really settle into, what am I afraid of right now? What am I feeling uncertain about? And what am I grateful for in this moment? It's a very grounding technique. The second is perfectionism. All of these keep this box around you. So the way she talks about perfectionism is that it's different than striving for excellence and really developing our skills. What she talks about in it is it's trying to minimize pain if we do something perfectly. Meaning, if I can just figure this out ahead of time, then less people will judge me for a mistake. And so then she talked about like the differences between like the perception of other people, what will they think about me, versus the internal motivation of like, I want to excel because I want it, not because I'm trying to prove something, not because I'm worried what other people will think. She said, this will always be a defense move. If you find yourself, or if you say that you are a perfectionist, it's because you are living with vulnerability armor and you are concerned about what other people think. Really let that settle in. I talk with a lot of people that call themselves a perfectionist, but what they are saying is they are wearing vulnerability armor and they're afraid of what people will think of them. So when we start to settle into that, it's a really powerful thing. And we're going to put up here, we're going to put number 3 up here so you can see it. The next is numbing. And I love what she describes as numbing, because this is what I see in my clients all of the time, is that numbing can be something like drinking alcohol. Numbing can be something like binging the internet, like everything that you want to read. Like that's all numbing, okay? But the numbing she talks about in the book is being crazy busy. She said that we will get to a point in our lives where it is easier to stay crazy busy than it is to feel the inadequacies happening inside of our body. Being crazy busy is hiding fears of inadequacy. Okay, really let that sink in, because once you start letting that sink in, then you'll start realizing all the things you're doing to help with the crazy busy is just further masking and keeping you in your vulnerability armor. You will never be able to dare greatly if you are numbing with crazy busy or anything else. If you want to dare greatly and achieve your full potential, you have to be willing to explore each of these things and move beyond them, which is what we're going to talk about in our last few minutes. So she leaves us just a couple steps as we go through. And she goes in, of course, in detail in all of these, is that in order to, we're just going to write that, in order to dare greatly, we have to understand the vulnerability of knowing when it's too much. And going back to the crazy busy mentality, I don't know if you ever had this analogy when you were a kid in church or otherwise, where you have a bowl and you fill it with dirt and then you stack rocks on top of it. Okay. And it's kind of like the whole point is like, you got to put the priorities first. So then you dump it all out and you put your rocks in and then you fill in the dirt around it and it fits, but it's like right at the top of it. And vulnerability is realizing that we don't have to live crazy busy stack to the top of our bowl. It's realizing we can take rocks and dirt out of the bowl and it all fits in very well. So the way she talks about it in the book is she kept looking for ways to manage her crazy busy time management. That's why people love, time management programs. That's why they love planners. That's why they tell them like the checklist and the to-do list in order to manage all that's going on. In order to move beyond and live in a place of vulnerability, it's learning how to stop living like that and looking for new ways of existing. That is one of the most daring things you can do because it's counterproductive to what everybody's talking about and what our kids need and what it takes to be a mom and all the demands that we have. It is literally learning a new way of living. And in order to do that, you have to really confront yourself and dare greatly. So the second thing that she talks about is that we have to really recognize, are the choices feeding our spirits? And or hiding our vulnerabilities. So when we start making choices, and again, this is putting ourselves out there. Are we speaking our truth? Are we speaking up for the things that we want? Going back to what Miranda was saying, that it's hard. It's hard to speak some of the things that we want, but our spirit is being effective when we are not doing those things. And you can feel that because you'll start feeling frustrated and resentful towards the people that you love. The next is to develop disruptive engagement. Now, the way she talks a lot about this in business in the book, but I want to apply it more to you as an individual. She talks about it's learning how to recognize when shame culture exists. From the South, I don't know if it's South or it's just like my parents' generation. I'm not really sure. But we always had a phrase that like when our dog was doing something naughty, it was like, shame on you. like now I look at it, I'm like, what a funny phrase. Like, why would we say that? Like, we thought it was effective to say shame. And that's really what you have to start recognizing, is that disruptive engagement is recognizing when there is a shame culture and creating something opposite from that. And it's giving ourselves a place of allowing constructive feedback. And one of the things that's very disruptive about the way I parent is I ask my kids for feedback. And most of the time they're like, oh, like I don't really know. But then later in some like other weird scenario, they'll bring it up. Like my son was so cute the other day. He's like, Mom, I feel like you and Dad have been on your phones a lot. And I was like I wanted to, like, my first thought was like, no, but I have to justify that you guys are out of school and we still have things that we're doing, but I caught myself and I recognized, oh, he's giving me, like, I've created this environment in my home. I don't want to shame him for this feedback. I want to accept it and receive it. And it was in that moment I could normalize, yes, this is very effective feedback. Thank you. And I was able to say that to him. And it was like you could see his whole body relax. He's only 10. It was so sweet. The other thing that she talks about is minding the gap. And this is the difference between where we are and where we want to be. Okay. So this is the gap right here that she talks about. And this is the difference. And I love where she talks about this in the book, because shortly after this, she talks about wholehearted parenting and how we have to mind the gap in our parenting as well. Because she says that who we are and how we engage with the world are much stronger predictors of how our children will do than what we know about parenting. So when she talks about that, and then she goes on to quote somebody else where it says, be who you want your children to become. And that's vulnerable right there. I'm going to be honest. That's a very vulnerable thing. Like, am I the person that I want my children to become? Not always. Like I want them to be better than me, but who we are speaks louder than what we say. So in order to dare greatly, in order to be vulnerable, even within our families, is we have to become that person we want our children to be, to set that example. That does not mean we are perfect. That means that we are examples of being a human, of apologizing, of making mistakes, of coming back and having conversations with them. It's going through um, it's going through and recognizing I can process emotions and I can teach them how to process their emotions. So I really want to leave you with this one question, okay? Who do you want to be? Very simple, but very deep. Who do you want to be? This is the gap that exists right there. This is the work that you have to do. This is where you start daring greatly to close this gap on who you want to be. So I'm going to leave you with just one quote from the book that I loved so much. Let's see if I have it. Okay, yeah, it's right here. Okay, compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness well can we be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. And that to me is so powerful, and I hope that's what you felt here in this book club. That's always my goal, is that we can come as equals, that we can experience and learn something from a place of shared humanity. And that's when, from that place where we're having compassion with ourselves, when we're recognizing our own worthiness, that's when we're able to face shame and vulnerability head on. That's when we're able to dare greatly. That's when we're able to reach our full potential. And we can do that. We can create very safe places in order to do that. So when my clients, and I will share this, as a certified life coach, I do take one-on-one clients, and we walk through this gap and help them, and I help them and coach them on how to become that person they want to be. And I see them do that because they are facing their shame and their vulnerability in a safe place more than they ever have before. And they are taking that courage to take those steps forward. So if that's something that you are interested in, I do offer free consultations. They're 60 minutes. It will be a very vulnerable experience. And I hope that you recognize that it's because that we can do that, because I view you as an equal. I view you as a worthy human that has a potential that you can achieve. And that when you do face your shame and vulnerability, you will propel yourself forward to anything that you want in this world and anything that you feel God is calling you to. So if that's something you're interested in, you can always reach out to me on Facebook. It's Laura Taylor Johnson, or if you get my emails, you can always respond back there. So I really appreciate, I'm going to leave a couple minutes for questions, but I do appreciate you coming today. For next month, and this is what the last thing I wanted to share. Oh, hold on, let me grab the book. We are doing one of my other favorite books is The Alchemist. This is one of the all-time best-selling books in the world. I can't remember. I mean, it's been translated into like 30 or 60 different languages or something. But it's one that speaks to our health. It's a fable. It's not as much self-help as some of the other books that we've done, but it really is about following our dreams and trusting God and looking for our own path and discovering that for ourselves. So I am going to go through. We always do a drawing for a free book. So if I call your name, then I will email you to get your contact information, because you can either get it on Audible or you can get a hardback book. Okay, so Sarah King. So yes, thank you, Connie, for the drum roll. Sarah King. Okay, that's who I've got. So Sarah, I will be reaching out to you to get your contact information so that I can either send it via Audible or hardback. So just know that next month, it's The Alchemist. It will be the fourth Thursday, 1 p.m. Mountain Time. If you are not on the calendar invite, or if there's any complications, let me know. I can go ahead and make sure that you are added on there. And yeah, we'll be talking about The Alchemist, which I'm so excited about. So I do have just a couple minutes. I would love any questions that you have. We can go through those. You already have the book. Oh, but thank you. Okay, well then we are going to draw somebody else. Hannah Lopez. Okay, Hannah, are you here? Okay. You don't have to unmute. Just know that I'm going to be reaching out to you. Okay, we'll figure that out. And Sarah, Thank you very much for coming, and we'll have to get you another time. We'll figure something else out for you. Let's see. Okay. Any questions? Okay. All right, Hannah, you're here. Great. I will reach out to you so that we can figure out, just be thinking if you want Audible or if you want like a paperback like this. Okay. Any questions? You can even unmute yourself. All of this part will be cut off of the recording, so don't worry about. You don't want to send it out to everybody. I always cut this part off. I guess one other thing, just if somebody's typing a question or unmuting yourself, the last thing is the calendar invite. The recording, video and audio version of this will go out tomorrow via email, but I'll also add it to the calendar invite if you scroll down to the bottom. I don't think it shows up very well on the phone, but it looks really pretty on a computer. I'm like really frustrated with technology and like trying to make it all work. So there's hyperlinks if you look on the computer so that you can read about the book on Amazon. They're not affiliate links or anything. They're just so that you can read about what book is coming up. And so that way you know what the next months are. But then if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see all the past recordings that we've done. So it's all kind of stored in one location for you. What is your favorite book for self-improvement that you have read? Oh, that's a really good question. I think it depends. Let me know, Sarah, your question on this. What type of self-improvement are you looking for? Are you looking more for habit, time management type things? Or are you looking more for like belief and possibility? Because I kind of separate those two. When I'm coaching my clients, there's like 3 different parts that I spend time in. The first is like discovering who you are, what your purpose is. There's certain books that have really impacted me with following my dreams. But then the other is like, how do you achieve them? And that's more like there's strategic things that go about. So Sarah, if you go over or you can even unmute yourself if that's easier. I'm curious what kind of self-improvement. Belief and possibility. I think my favorite one is probably the one we did last. Okay, Connie, I'll come back to your question. My favorite one was probably the one we did last month, The Big Leap. And actually The Alchemist. Those 2 were like right at the beginning for me of discovering who I am. And it so clearly explained why I lacked possibility and belief in what my future held. Especially The Big Leap. That one was very life-changing. So if you want the recording on that, that would probably be one that I would recommend and I can send to you. Yes, The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. The Audible, I have both. I have the actual and like the hardback as well as the Audible. And Gay Hendricks is like this wise old grandpa that like every time I listen to him, I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm sitting across from my grandpa, just like having a conversation about life. So that one, Sarah, I would definitely recommend that one. It's a good one. Connie, as far as which one for strategic planning for myself, one that is like really popular is the Atomic Habits by James Clear. That's a really popular one, Connie. And I don't know for me if that one spoke as clearly. And this will go back to, Becky's question as well. The one that really changed things as far as strategic planning and time management was Essentialism. And both of those we did earlier as well. So you can see the recording on those and you can kind of get an overview before you order the book if you want, or if you order the book and you still want to go, deeper level and applying it, those recordings are really good. The Atomic Habits is really building out the habits for yourself based on what you believe, like who you are, and understanding like your habits, your habit loops that we get stuck in. Essentialism, like I have read so many books on time management. I'll be honest, Becky, because I was one that had like the very crazy busy, and Essentialism helped me stop living crazy busy. That was one that like really stepped me outside of recognizing why I lived that way and how to change living from that way. It was amazing. There were so many things that I learned in that book. And that's Essentialism by Greg McCow. Actually, let me see. I think it's upstairs. Otherwise, I'd show it to you. But it's got like a picture of like a swirl on the front of it. And Atomic Habits has, I'm very visual, can you tell? And Atomic Habits has like sparkly like dots on the front of it. And so Atomic Habits, James Clear, Essentialism, Greg McCow. But yeah, those were probably the two that I find have been the most beneficial for me thus far. So those are really good questions. Any other questions before we jump off? I'm always worried of like cutting somebody off while they're typing. If there are questions, feel free to send me a message on Facebook Messenger or just send me an email. All right, all you wonderful, wonderful people. I will see you next month. Again, if you would like a consultation, let's jump on the phone for 60 minutes. Let's dive into what's going on for you. Recordings will be on the calendar invite, and I will see you next month. Thanks for coming.